Welcome, everyone. My name is Ann Smiley-Oyen, and I'm an associate professor in kinesiology in the area of neuromotor control. Welcome to this, our second lecture in a series on the topic of Move for Life, the health benefits of exercise across the lifespan. Before I go any further, I just want to say a word to the undergraduates just to remind you that if you are here and want credit, your professor has set that up. The scanner is back in the lobby. And please stay seated if at all possible through questions and answers. Thanks. These lectures are made possible by the Helen LeBaron Hilton Endowed Chair Series. Helen LeBaron Hilton, picture of her there, was the Dean of Home Economics from 1952 to 1975 here at Iowa State University, and was a worldwide visionary and a strong advocate for enhancing the status of women and the well-being of children. In addition to her many accolades, she served on national committees at the request of President Eisenhower and then President Kennedy. She was active locally, here even in Ames government, in the state, in the nation, and internationally, including directing a 10-year home economics education program in India, which was funded by the Ford Foundation. Her influence made a lasting and significant impact on home economics here at Iowa State and in the field at large. In this 2016 series of lectures, we're examining the many ways that and the many systems that are impacted by exercise. If you picked up one of these, you will see that Dr. Miriam Nelson will be here on February 15th, and she will be discussing the impact of exercise on bone and muscle. And that's on page 3. On page 5, Dr. James Blumenthal will be here, and he will be discussing the impact of physical activity on mental health, and especially on depression. And then Dr. Aimin Lee was actually here in the fall, and she talked on the topic of exercise, the impact of exercise on chronic diseases. She'll be back in April. We do not know the exact date yet, but she'll wrap it up. She's kind of our bookends. She'll wrap it up on this series. Tonight I have the distinct pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Daniel Korkos. Dr. Korkos is a professor in the Department of Physical Therapy and Human Movement Science at Northwestern University in Chicago. He received his PhD from the University of Oregon. That as soon as he begins to speak, you will realize that he hails from England. He has a long track record of hundreds of publications and decades of funding through the National Institutes of Health. His area of research is the neural basis of human movement and movement disorders in humans. His more specific focus has been on force generation. He's done a lot of work with EMG, looking at force generation in healthy people and then in people with Parkinson's disease. More recently, he is examining the effects of progressive resistance exercise and its impact on people with Parkinson's disease and on their symptoms. And in addition, he's a great mentor and he's a delightful friend. Would you please help me in giving him a warm cyclone welcome?
I would very much like to thank Anne for inviting me, and it is a real distinct pleasure, honor, and privilege to be at the home of the Cyclones. I've been here for my 4th visit, and I kind of look out. There's lots of red, lots of orange. It is a great university, and I'm delighted to be here. So I'm going to talk to you about exercise and the brain. And one of the privileges about being here and talking to you is that there are clearly at least 3 generations represented, maybe even 4. Now I know that many of the great-grandchildren or the little children are at home, the 9, 10-year-olds. But one of the things I want to take, one of the messages I want to leave you with is that what I'm talking about, the benefits of exercise, are at every age, across every generation. And one of the other messages I want to give you is, my guess is, and most of you, if not all of you, are going to know most of what I tell you. And the people who really need to hear the message are in fact those of the people who are not here. And so when you go back to wherever you live, you don't nag your friends, but you just kind of gently find ways to encourage them to progressively move just a little bit more, because it's good for them. And at the end of the hour, I hope to give you enough data to really persuade you that it's good for them, and it's good for you, and it's good for all of us. So I'm going to start off for maybe 5 or 10 minutes and just walk you through current exercise guidelines, what people should do. I'm then going to walk you through a little bit about the declines, and I use my words carefully here, that can take place as we age. So as we age, there are declines, but the question is, what can we do to mitigate them, and are we willing to do things to mitigate them? And I'm going to show you how exercise slows the decline in brain structure and function over time. I'm going to show you lots of pictures of the brain, and I'm going to show you that exercise is good for the brain. And as I mentioned in my introduction, I'm going to point out that exercise benefits brain health for not only you, but your parents, your children, your grandchildren. And then I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about the benefits of both acute and chronic exercise. So just make sure we all understand the terms. Most of the time, we view exercise as a good long-term thing to do. So we exercise every week, and this has a chronic, sustained, beneficial effect over time. But it is also the case that if you do an acute bout of exercise, you exercise once, many people feel better afterwards. And so there are benefits immediately after exercising, which is the acute benefits. There's also the chronic. So it is now axiomatic, exercise is beneficial. So the cover page of Time, September 11/12, talks about the exercise cure. Perhaps a slight overstatement that it's a cure, but it is a very, very potent medicine for pretty much everything, okay? And if any of you want this cover, I can send it to you. I have friends, they have it as their screensaver on their computer, they have it as their screensaver on their iPhone. And it just may remind you. It's also a wonderful article to read because it is written beautifully at the level of an educated layperson. And it walks you through why it's so important to care about exercise. Now, the Greeks knew it was good for us. The Chinese knew it was good for us. But it is still quite hard. Now, I happen to be a fan of the Irish writer, the great Irish writer, Oscar Wilde. And Oscar Wilde often gets it just about right. The problem is that to get back to my youth, I would do anything in the world except take exercise, get up early, or be respectable. And so that is the problem, and that is the problem we are dealing with. It's in the picture of Dorian Gray. Now, Time magazine gives these statistics. You can find them on the internet. They're pretty much everywhere. So only 20% of Americans get the recommended 150 minutes of strength and cardiovascular physical activity per week. More than half of all baby boomers report doing no exercise whatsoever. And 80.2 million Americans over age 6 are entirely inactive. This is a major health problem. So there are kind of 4 key guidelines. And the first part of this is very simple, but profound. Avoid inactivity. Lengthy periods of inactivity are not good. Very interesting. I went to several offices today. Many of the faculty here have the desks that you can stand up at. And they move and they walk around and they're active. You get substantial health benefits from medium amounts of aerobic activity. You get more health benefits from high amounts of aerobic activity, and muscle strengthening activities provide additional health benefits. So this is the kind of simple big picture guidelines. For substantial health benefits, you need 2.5 hours a week of moderate intensity aerobic activity. One way to think about that, and many people like to walk. If you're out walking for an hour and you can hold a conversation, maybe a little hard at times to hold it, that's moderate, okay? Or 75 minutes of vigorous aerobic activity. Once you're at the level of vigorous, then holding that conversation becomes much, much harder. And you can do a combination of the two. It may not be possible to get it all in one go, so 10-minute bouts are good. And you need to spread it out through the week. You can't just do 150 minutes in one go and think you're going to get the same amount of benefit. Now, muscle strengthening guidelines. Now, strengthening is really important. I was talking to a couple of people, they don't like doing it. Well, at the end of the day, some people don't like doing it, but there's no substitute for doing strengthening. And you should do it 2 or more times a week. So it requires moderate to high level of intensity. The number of repetitions should be 8 to 12. And if you do resistance training, 1 set is sufficient. You should do it 2 days a week. And then you have to work the major muscle groups. And I'll be showing you this. I'm going to be showing you some pictures. But the idea is to exercise your major muscle groups. Your legs, hips, back, chest, abdomen, shoulders, and arms. Now, the idea behind exercise that many people think is in terms of regenerative medicine. And I've highlighted in yellow the quote from Marcus Bammon, who's a very distinguished professor at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. And exercise is regenerative medicine. It restores and repairs and basically fixes things that are broken. And I'm going to show you later on in my talk how exercise is very good for the neurons in your brain. So think of exercise as regenerative medicine. Now I'm going to go through a little bit of background because I know we have people from the public, and I'm going to walk you through a few slides to give you a sense of what the brain is. So the human brain is about 3 pounds, 1.4 kilograms. It's a mass of jelly-like fats and tissues, yet it's the most complex of all known living structures. I mean, the brain is formidably complex, and that's why we know so very little about it. It has up to 1 trillion nerve cells that must work together and coordinate our physical, our movement actions, and also the mental processes that set us apart. So this is just kind of a schematic of the brain. So one has 4 major brain lobes. So you have a temporal lobe, a frontal lobe, a parietal lobe, and then sitting back here on the back of the head, the posterior part here, is the occipital lobe. So you have the cranium, here you have the cortex, and I want you to kind of look at you have the gyri here, and you have the sulci here. Then deep inside the brain, the deep brain structure, you'll hear about it a lot in terms of Parkinson's, a lot about it in terms of surgery for Parkinson's. You have the basal ganglia. So when one has surgery for Parkinson's, it's all in the basal ganglia, which is very deep into the brain. Then we have the brain stem. Sometimes hear about people with spinal cord who have spinal cord injury. And then in the back here, you have the cerebellum. So this is a big, complicated structure that controls your movements, actions, and thoughts. So here we have the slice through the brain. It's at this level here, just the cerebellum is sitting below. This is the front part of the brain. This is the rear part of the brain. So here we have the thalamus. And I want you to pay particular attention here to the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle, and you can see it over here. I want you to really memorize the fact that you have ventricles. In the brain, you have ventricles, and ventricles contain fluid, and they're very important. But ideally, you don't want the ventricles to become too big. So just remember the ventricles. And that's the main thing that I want you to take from here as you look across this brain slice. Now, I want to give you a sense of how big the brain disease burden is, okay? So Alzheimer's disease, the number of Americans living with Alzheimer's is growing, and it's growing fast. 5.4 million Americans have Alzheimer's disease. 1 in 9 people 65 and older have Alzheimer's. And by 2050, and this is what the health system in America is going to be confronted with, because by 2050, this is going to be a huge burden. Someone in the United States will develop the disease every 33 seconds. And it is very expensive to care for people with Alzheimer's in the advanced stage. They need care 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Over 1 million people have Parkinson's disease, and 650,000 or more per year have stroke. And this is really a major problem. I want you to look long and hard at this brain. There are 2 brains. One of these brains you would probably like to have as your own. And one of these brains... No, that's me, I'm sorry. That's okay. I think that is somebody answering the question for you. So, okay? Okay. So this will give us a good chance to focus on this, okay? We're going to put our hands up, okay, in a minute. So from your point of view, this is the right brain, and this is the left brain. Now, one of these brains is really healthy, and the other brain is not so healthy. So hands up those of you who would be happier to have this brain than this brain. So put your hands up if you like to... Okay? And hands up those of you who would prefer this brain. Wow. I've known for a long time how smart people in Iowa, and this absolutely confirms it. Okay? Because we have over here, if you are suspected of having Alzheimer's disease, you may well have a CT scan or some other scan. And the big giveaway is you have all this fluid in the ventricles. The other big giveaway is you have all these kind of hollow parts here. If you compare it with this brain, which is much less of the, you see much less black here. You've got this huge amount of black and these huge ventricles. So one of the things, you know, the younger you are, the more you can work on this. So I'm talking to everybody, but primarily to the undergraduates. Start early. Look after yourselves, because there are things one can do to minimize this. I'm not saying you can avoid it. I am saying there are things you can do to minimize this. So now I'm going to kind of show you some classic slides of the kind of typical decline as one ages. So we have here word recall, logical memory, paired associate memory. And these are all in normalized scores. So early on, one is above a normalized reference value, and one has this precipitous decline. So by the age of 60, one is not doing as well with one's memory. Of course, as I tell everybody who's willing to listen, I have these plots of accumulated wisdom, where by the age of my current age, one is getting wiser by the year. But in just straight cognitive decline, and you're going to learn something about me, I'm quasi-delusional, because I'm going to show you some other slides which do that. But by and large, most things go down. But I do think there is a lot to be said for the wisdom of grandparents, and it more than compensates for this. Now, I want the undergraduates to pay particular attention to this slide, because this is a very, very important slide, and those in kinesiology should all get this. So now we're looking at knee strength and leg muscle mass, okay? And this is the 25 to 34, 35 to 44, and here we have the 85-year-olds plus. And so you see what you have here is you have this big, you have this decline in knee strength. But here it suddenly gets really large in the 80s. It's kind of disproportionate. You would like to think it would be here. Now, if you look at the muscle mass, it's kind of declining at the same rate. And you have this big, big difference here. Now, normally, strength is proportional to cross-sectional area. But I think what is happening here is that people are starting to get weaker and weaker as they get older, and it's not just muscle. It is the way the brain is involved in recruiting muscle. So when you generate force, it is the brain that tells the muscle to contract. And if the brain starts to suffer from pathology, then it's working less well. And so even if the muscle mass is okay, you don't have the right drive to the muscle. And I think it's further evidence for why you want to look after your brain. So over here we have men, over here we have women. The take-home message is the same. So we're going from 10 to 80, and this is the cerebrospinal fluid, the CSF space. So what's basically happening is your water in your brain is slightly going up, okay? And the gray matter, the cells, which are doing all the thinking and moving, they're going down. And the white matter, the matter which passes information, the big long tracts in the brain, that also starts to go down. And you can see here on this particular fitted curve, okay, that if you now start to go out, if you start to fill in this data, that you will get more and more of the fluid. And so it's a further reason to try to protect your brain. There is a huge effort being paid in science to try to find early markers of disease. So the idea is that once you have Alzheimer's disease, it's hard to help people. But if you can delay the rate at which people get disease, if you can reduce the rate, this is really good. And so what scientists are after are early markers. That's aspects of behavior which indicate there's something wrong in the nervous system. So you may not have a disease, but something is going wrong. Well, the best, or one of the best current markers is a sense of smell, because that's also controlled in the brain. And so if you begin to lose your sense of smell, it does not tell you which disease you have, but it does start to hint that you may have a brainstem pathology, and it may be associated with a disease. So if you ever hear of somebody who's starting to lose their sense of smell, it's a good marker to go and see a physician. So this is the way the sense of smell normally declines, because we have age here, and this is the smell score. And then what you have, for example, if you have Parkinson's disease, you will have an onset of the disease, and so your sense of smell here will be declining more steeply for two reasons. One, it declines at the same rate as if you're aging, because you have part of the aging process. But it actually declines much more steeply. And so this is the slope that is fitted for people with Parkinson's disease. So their smell is declining much more steeply. So sense of smell is what is called a biomarker, and this is a very potent biomarker for potential neurodegeneration. Now, this is the vicious circle of Parkinson's disease, which is what I primarily study, but many of you may study other diseases or know of people with other diseases, and you can basically put in here almost any disease that you want, okay? And so if in Parkinson's disease, you have gait alterations, postural instability, and falls. It is diagnosed as a motor disease. It is thought of as a motor disease. It has a very strong non-motor side, a very strong affective side. It can be easily and frequently accompanied by depression, apathy. So when one works with individuals with Parkinson's disease, part of the challenge is, if one is apathetic, why should one exercise? But the exercise is a good way of getting out of the apathy. That's why there's very much a circle here. Constipation, sleep problems, fatigue. And then this builds up the sedentary lifestyle, which furthers physical inactivity. And what's important to note is the people who wrote this have a dashed arrow up here. So the pharmaceutical industry is working very hard to develop medicine which will protect neurons. It's called neuroprotection, and it wants to slow the rate at which neurons die and slow the rate at which they're failing to produce dopamine. Now, you can argue that if you can create something which is neuroprotective, maybe if you actually stop doing activity, you're doing the opposite of neuroprotection, and you are in fact advancing the rate at which the disease, which is actually what I think is the case. And then you see what happens. Unfortunately, when you get one disease, it does not spare you from another disease. So the others all kick in. And so you can maybe have osteoporosis and ultimately mortality. And so the goal here is to minimize this. Now, what does exercise do? Well, we are in the wonderful state of Iowa. And what Iowa is great for is biking. So we'll just take biking as one example. Okay? And so here you have a schematic of a brain which is not very active. And so you go out and exercise, and it's doing wonders for your visual system, your olfactory, your acoustic system. You have intrinsic feedback. You have what are called Golgi tendon organs, muscle spindles. They're all important for movement and balance. Exercise is good for all the other systems that other speakers will talk about. And then it's really good for thinking, cognition, memory. It's good for executive function, how you organize things, how you sequence things, prefrontal and cingulate cortex. It's very important for emotional regulation in the amygdala and prefrontal cortex. It can help in motivation in the hypothalamus, accumbens, and ventral tegmental area. And then these are 5 brain areas. Parkinson's disease is thought of as an inflammatory disease. So you have inflammatory markers which may be up or down regulated. But what we're trying to do is elicit change, which is repair or plasticity or neuroprotect or develop new nerves, and thus improve motor control and thinking. So that's what we're trying to do, and that's what much research is based upon. So many of you think that the reason you exercise is to have this really nice, elegant set of triceps or nice shapely pair of legs or whatever. But really, it's to get that brain going. Now this is another one of my delusional slides. And there are 2 take-home messages here. So here we have age, and here we have maximum strength. So here we have all of our undergraduates, 20, 21, 22, doing really well. I tend to put myself here, but nobody believes me. Dr. Smiley Oyen is slightly to the left of me, younger and much more engaging than I am. And then we're moving over, and then you can see what happens at round about 60. There are kind of 2 paths that people can go on. You can either carry on and still be reasonably strong and active, or you have this decline. And so when I'm starting to sound like a preacher, what I'm trying to preach is ways in which we minimize the decline. Now sometimes one ends up with a problem or a disease, and one can't do anything. But most of the time, I think one can. I do a lot of work studying the brain. And we have a big magnet, and you lie down, you go in the magnet, you generate muscle force, you press very hard on here. And so what you see here is that this is jumping up, it's going to jump up when it's green, and now you're holding force. So at this point in time, you're lying in the magnet, you're holding force, you rest, you hold force, you rest, you hold force, you rest. And just by doing this simple activity here of generating muscle force, the brain is very, very much active. The cerebellum is lit up, and also you see the basal ganglia nuclei are lit up. So what I'm trying to find is the regions of the brain which are not working well in Parkinson's disease, and then ask the question, is there anything we can do for those regions of the brain? And so in this slide, this is the globus pallidus. It's a nucleus in the basal ganglia. It's the internal segment. This is the subthalamic nucleus. This is where stimulators are placed for people with Parkinson's disease, deep in the brain. And what I want you to notice over here, when a person generates 60% of their maximum muscle force, so they're pressing pretty hard, 60% as hard as they can do, both the left and the right globus pallidus are activated. And so this is very strong evidence that generating force activates the regions of the brain that are known to be impaired in this progressive disease. Now here are a couple of ladies showing you that one can really get into the gym and work out. And they did for a couple of years, or longer, I hope. So I ran a 2-year study, and they did 11 exercises. They do a chest press, a reverse fly, a latissimus dorsi pull down, a double leg press. One doesn't always have to do exercises this vigorous with machines. There are lots of ways to finesse that, and there are lots of people in kinesiology who can help you finesse that if you want to start exercising. But this is a good way of doing it. Then there's hip extension. It's very important to work the hip extensors. Biceps curl, shoulder press, rotary calf. And here we have the triceps extension. And here we have seated quad and back extension. And these exercises are really good for muscle, and they're really good for brain. Now, I'm going to show you some PR. Now, this is just publicity, and then I'll show you some data. But this is just PR. This was from the news channel in Chicago.
A small group of patients here in Chicago is finding the effects of Parkinson's disease can be minimized without medication.
CBS 2's Vince Girasoli has a look at the research that stands to change the lives of those with the disorder.
Keep your chest lifted, keep breathing.
His workouts with the trainer are about much more than getting in shape.
Squeeze. Excellent.
David Brevellier has Parkinson's disease. Moving his muscles has been a challenge for decades.
I suddenly found that for large portions of the day, I couldn't move. And for about a week, I was just scared.
Whoa, slow it down, slow it down, slow it down.
After 2 years of these sessions, David is obviously feeling different, both physically and mentally.
I believe that I can virtually credit my survival to it.
And pull. Good job. Good. Go.
Brevellier gets a second workout of sorts as part of a study at Rush University Medical Center and the University of Illinois in Chicago. Here, researchers are gauging the impact of stretching and weight training on the muscle control of Parkinson's patients when they aren't taking medication. Initial results are promising.
We're finding people when they came in couldn't even stand on one leg for 1 second, and 6 months after the exercise program are standing on a leg 20 seconds, 30 seconds, 40 seconds, some people up to a minute.
Look here, while a healthy patient could push this bar with one smooth muscle movement, Parkinson's patients require a series of muscle bursts.
You can see you've got multiple bursts. You got 1, 2, 3, 4.
So for a healthy person, there'd be one complete burst, and in a Parkinson's patient here, you see multiple bursts.
Correct.
But check out the change in the graph after just 6 months of training.
In this case, they only have 1, 2 bursts prior to peak velocity.
That's a dramatic difference, isn't it?
Oh, it's a substantial difference.
This is new. I think your average neurologist, when they take care of a Parkinson patient, doesn't mention exercise. They mention drugs.
Just nice and
They don't
slow.
mention exercise.
Physicians in the study say these first results indicate exercise can partially liberate patients from the drowsiness and motor complications that can be side effects of Parkinson's medication.
Can I ask how old you are?
66.
David knows he will never be medication-free, but he sure likes the changes in his life.
The differences between living like I'm 85 or 90 years old all the time, or having a lot of times where I feel I can get up like I'm 30 or so years old.
48 patients are taking part in this study, working out at least twice a week. Doctors say their muscle movements will never return to normal, but all are showing some signs of improvement.
And Vince tells us the patients are placed in 2 groups, one that only does stretching and one that only does weight training. The complete study will be done in about 2 years.
So I presented this first time in London, England, to my very good friend, Professor John Rothwell, who's a very distinguished neuroscientist. And he told me, Daniel, all as you have shown me is when you take somebody who's a little bit older and you pair them with somebody who's a lot younger, they feel really great about themselves. And I think, at this point in time, that's all I've shown you. Now I'm going to provide you some data that is actually a little bit more than just nice people. So the Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale, and that is the UPDRS up here, is the standard way Parkinson's disease is assessed. When you have lots of tremor, lots of rigidity, lots of bradykinesia, and lots of postural instability, you have a high score. When you have none of those 4 cardinal signs, you have a score of 0. People with kind of medium stage Parkinson's disease have scores in the region of 30 to 40. So what I'm showing you here is 0, 6, 12, 18, and 24 months, because we had 2 groups of people exercise for 2 years. One did the heavy-duty progressive resistance. Another group did a program called fitness counts, which is just easy stretching. It's not as vigorous. And it is not progressive, and it's not designed to build up strength in the same way. And then we're going to look at the mean change from baseline in the motor part of the Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale score. So at baseline, the mean change will be 0. After 6 months, people were about 6 to 7 points better, and both groups improved. And what happens is when you deal with almost any disease, it's not just Parkinson's disease, people become so deconditioned that just getting into a car, going to the gym, doing stretches, doing some strengthening is very good for you. So at 6 months, there is no difference. And over time, the group who did not do progressive resistance, they ended back at 0. Here we have natural disease progression. So over a 2-year period, people get about 3 points per year worse. So the disease is progressing, and you're about 3 points a year worse. So at the end of 2 years, the people who did fitness counts were about 6 points better off. And the people who did the progressive resistance exercise were actually about 13 points better off. So this shows that exercise can reduce the symptoms of the disease. So here's the measure of strength. This is the progressive resistance group, and they are 10 Newton meters stronger after 2 years. The other group got a little bit stronger to begin with and then declined. These are the extensor muscles. I have some data here from my good colleague Marcus Bamman at the University of Alabama. He had people with Parkinson's disease for 16 weeks really do very, very vigorous, heavy weight training. They start off a little bit weaker. So here we have a matched control group. This is what is called the standard error. So this is the variability about the mean. Individuals with Parkinson's disease are a little bit below that. So they are generally weaker, and that's been shown. But at the end of 16 weeks, they are really, really strong. And I can tell you, if I was trying to get moving around a house and getting out of a chair and doing things, there's a real benefit to being stronger. Now this is the part which is just not obvious to many people, but it also works very well for cognition. So the idea that you're getting smarter by working your muscle, it's just not obvious, but it's true. So this is the digit span. This is a test of memory, working memory. And pretty much everything we do resides around working memory. And if your working memory starts to decline, then doing a lot of things becomes very, very difficult. And here is a group of people followed for 12 months, and they stayed the same. They have Parkinson's disease. They didn't decline, they didn't improve. These are the 2 separate groups, and this is the average. So there was no difference between the fitness counts or the progressive resistance exercise, but both forms of exercise led to improvement in working memory. So some people find pushing weights hard, and some people are not motivated to have nicer triceps. But the idea of working your brain to improve your cognition, I hope to leave you with the idea that that should be motivating. And this is a very recent study. Most of the studies that I'm going to show you next, they're all very recent. They're quite data intensive. I just try to make sure that you get the ultimate take-home message. But the idea here is that weight training increases posterior cingulate thickness. Okay, so here we have the posterior cingulate, And the idea is that after a year of weight training, that part of the brain is getting thicker. And anything you can do to increase cortical thickness is good. And so what you have over here is you have computerized cognitive training and progressive resistance training, and they're slightly above, okay? And over a year, the people who were in the sham condition, their cortical thickness got less. And so if you now look over here, we're now plotting cortical thickness change, okay? And we're plotting that against improvement in cognition from the Alzheimer's disease score. So the idea is that that there's an increase in cortical thickness is associated with a better score on the Alzheimer's disease test. So this is the first evidence to show that weight training can actually increase cognitive thickness that I'm aware of, and that is good. Now, another way to do weight training is in what is called an unstable environment. So you will do these 5 exercises, which are up here: leg press, plantar flexion, half squat, lats, chest press. These are the kind of exercises you should only do with a lot of guidance, a lot of support, probably a personal trainer. But they're very good for you because this instability makes you really work on your posture, your balance. You also have to attend. You have to really, really think. So to do a half squat with unstable devices below your feet and on your back is very, very demanding. And so you'd ask yourself the question, well, why would anybody ever think of doing that? And I think it's a very good question. Well, here's why. This was only over 16 weeks. So this is the control group, has no change in UPDRS. Resistance training group, no change in UPDRS. We're looking here at the pre-test versus the post-test, pre-test versus the post-test. Here, the resistance training group with instability improved by about 5 points. And so that is important. What is more important is if we go here. So the MoCA is the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, and it is used to screen people for research. And if you have a score of 25 or less, you're diagnosed with having mild cognitive impairment. Sometimes you want to exclude people with mild cognitive impairment in studies. Sometimes you want to study mild cognitive impairment. Now, in this particular study, if we look here, this is the MoCA score. This is the research training instability group. The mean is below the 25, and afterwards, on the post-test, it's above. Here we're plotting the mild cognitive impairment percentage. For this group, most were actually mildly cognitively impaired, and at the end of the training. So this training has taken people who are mildly cognitively impaired back into a normal range. And you can see that more clearly here. This is the cutoff point for mild cognitive impairment. People started here with mild cognitive impairment, and as a result of doing the exercise, many lost, or the mild cognitive impairment was no longer there. So, exercise the muscle to exercise the brain. Now we're going to go on to endurance exercise. Endurance exercise is also very important. And here's the rationale. There are many reasons for endurance exercise. In Parkinson's disease, we want to increase the dopamine metabolism. We want to kind of increase the growth of blood vessels, increase the growth of neurons, increase our ability to use oxygen. So that's maximum VO2 there. The more efficiently, the better our walking economy is, the better it is. It's easier to get around, to locomote. We're after plastic changes. We're trying to get changes in the brain. We're trying to get the inflammation correct. Sometimes that's increasing inflammation, sometimes it's reducing it, but you want to get inflammation correct. You want to improve mitochondrial function and oxidative stress. The brain is always talking to itself. It's always talking to different parts of the brain, and that's called brain connectivity. And you want to optimize brain connectivity, and you want to increase levels of neurotrophic factors, such as brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Now, this is a study, an endurance study done over 1 year, and you're looking at baseline, 6 months, and 1 year. And this is the volume in the left hippocampus. The left hippocampus is very much involved in working memory, short-term memory. And what you'll notice here is that in the group who did endurance exercise for a year, the volume increased. Remember all those slides I showed you about decrease, decrease, decrease? Well, we're starting to reverse that. And the group that didn't exercise, well, they decreased. This is another part of the basal ganglia, the left caudate nucleus. There wasn't a difference here, but there's a trend to at least the left caudate not getting smaller. Again, this is volume. So this is just another slide. This is the motor fitness of the globus pallidus. And if we look here, this is motor fitness. This is more motor fitness. And in this particular study, people exercised, and there was a positive relationship between fitness and global pallidus volume. I'm going to show you several slides like this, just to show you now the evidence is coming out more and more strongly. And these papers are all 2014, 15, and 16. This is all very, very new. So this is increased thalamic volume with increased fitness in MS. MS is another disease which significantly compromises movement. And again, what you can see here is that you have cardiorespiratory fitness on the x-axis, and here we have a scaled thalamic volume, and the fitter the person, the higher the thalamic volume. You can see the same thing here for caudate volume. We're plotting the same cardiorespiratory fitness, and we're plotting the same thing here for hippocampal volume with increased fitness. Bottom line, the fitter you are, the fitter your brain. Now, this is a very, very recent study. It's just come out in 2016, and there was a review written about it in 2017. And the argument here is that exercise becomes the brain. So how do you get to that argument? So what they showed in this study, this is an animal study. This has been done on rats, especially bred rats. And so physical exercises increases the adult hippocampal neurogenesis. So they're having new neurons growing in the hippocampus in male rats, but the exercise had to be aerobic and sustained. So if you want to maximize your likelihood of neurogenesis occurring in your brain, you need to do sustained aerobic exercise. And this is a study in animals. Very hard to show this in humans because you can't go in and biopsy the hippocampus in a human. And so much of the work done on animals, it is an extrapolation. We certainly hope it applies. Now, how many of you have heard of the Framingham or the Framingham study? That's okay. The Framingham study is a very, very famous study. Started back in 1948. And if you go and look for many of the guidelines that we have for the cardiovascular system, they all come from the data of the Framingham study. So they studied about 5,500 people, and they've now gone over 3 generations, and they've looked at lifestyle, and that's where they're getting all the recommendations about cardiovascular health and what you should do. It's a very important study. It's ongoing, out of Boston University. And what they recently started to do is to add brain imaging as well. And so if you go and look closely at this paper, it will show you in terms of cerebral volume and hippocampal volume is higher in those who are working out. So on the brain MRI measures, they found that the physical activity index was linear related to total cerebral, brain, and hippocampal volume. So this is a study on humans. It's not showing neurogenesis in the way that you can show in rats, because you can't go in and actually measure the neurons. But it is showing that those whose physical activity index is higher have a larger volume, and that could be good. In the brain, you have white matter, and it is the white matter which communicates from one part of the brain to the other. It is the white matter which is a problem, for example, in multiple sclerosis, where you have problems with the myelination. And so when the white matter is not communicating very well, this is a problem. Now, there's a very technical, fancy term called fractional anisotropy. And when you have fractional anisotropy of 0, this is not good. So imagine you have some water and you put some oil in, it's going to diffuse everywhere. So in the brain, when you've got white matter, which is meant to connect parts of the brain, you don't want a number like 0. You don't want the information going everywhere. You want it to go down these tracks. And so what people do is they put people in a magnet, and here we have 6 different sections of the brain. You've got a slice 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And here you're having increases in this measure, fractional anisotropy, which means the connection between this part of the brain and this part of the brain is improved. And I want you to notice here you have something called the corpus callosum. You have 2 hemispheres to the brain. The 2 hemispheres talk to each other, and it's much better when they're communicating well. And so if you now look at these data here, so this is the GNU of the corpus callosum, for example, the fractional anisotropy. There are 3 other brain regions, and then this is VO2 max. And so you have this slight positive trend that the fitter you are, the higher your measure of fractional anisotropy, which is another way of saying that the integrity of your white matter tracts is better. So this is like a structural brain image. This again has come out in 2016. This is all about as recent as you can get. And this is another study in 2016 relating physical activity to better brain perfusion. So the better your circulation is, the better the blood is flowing through the brain, the better the oxygenation of neurons is going to be. And if you look at these 2 lines here, you have age. Both are declining, but the green dots are the fitter people and the red dots are the less fit. So again, if you want to maintain good blood perfusion throughout your brain, it is good to be fit. Now, I did tell you at the beginning that I was going to talk to you across the lifespan, and I think it's important to go across the lifespan. There's also a very strong physical education, teacher education program here, and I'm a great believer in physical education for kids, and I'm a great believer in physical activity. And so what you look here, this is an acute aerobic endurance. So what you do is you give kids 30 minutes of exercise. Just one bout of exercise. And then you show behaviorally, using some clever cognitive tasks, that right afterwards their cognition is better. And then you go into various brain regions and you show that you've got an increase in the left cerebellum, the right cerebellum, the left superior parietal lobe, the right superior to parietal lobe, and here you have the left hippocampus. So we come back again. So we went to a rat study on the hippocampus and neurogenesis. We showed you the Framingham study, and now we're showing you that in children, that if you exercise, it is good for the hippocampus. One of the most difficult areas of study in exercise is dose. How much should we do? So on the one hand, we know many of us have a little bit of Oscar Wilde in us, and so the less we need to exercise, the better. There is that tendency. I can't give you an answer, but I can show you here that in terms of the effects of exercise on changes in depression, the important thing is you exercise. So here is change in depression severity. This is tau is treatment as usual. And then they show that you have reduced depression, but it doesn't matter whether it's light, moderate, or vigorous. And one of the reasons it's hard to study dose is that you may need high intensity for one thing, maybe muscle hypertrophy, but only a moderate or low intensity for example, depression or apathy. And so part of this is to play around with yourself or with your spouse or with whoever you work out with to try to find what works for you. Now, who would like to tell me a disease that doesn't benefit from exercise? Let me turn it round on you. Yes? Are you sure? Okay. I mean, if you're sure and you're a physician, then I'm willing to believe you, but I doubt it. I mean, I'll give you one example of a disease which even now physicians will tell you you should not exercise, but they're wrong, okay? And that is, it is recommended if you have diabetes and ulcers that you don't exercise. Now, if you don't exercise for 6 months, you are so deconditioned, and the research will come out to show that is wrong. So can anybody tell me in the 1950s, if you had a heart attack, what was the treatment for a heart attack? Bed rest. 6 weeks of bed rest. And what do they do now? Okay, they really have these cardiac stress tests, and they really push that pump really, really hard. So my thesis is that there is no disease for which exercise isn't good. There may be one, but look real carefully, because the history of medicine, cerebral palsy, it used to be argued, don't give strength training, it makes you more spastic. It was wrong. There's a litany of examples like this. Now, one of the real problems is how to get people to exercise, and you've just got to work on this. Some people like to walk with their friend, and really what they like to do is talk for an hour, but at the end of the day, they've got their 3 hours, they've got their 3 miles of exercise in, and it's terrific, and that's great. Some people like personal training. I think if you have a disease, there's a lot to be said for seeing a therapist, physical therapist, every 6 months for a tune-up. Make sure your gait is fine. If you're starting to stumble, if you're starting to hesitate, if you're starting to freeze, maybe they can give you some exercises. Some people like working out alone. For others, this is a nightmare. Some people like group training. Circuit training at the Y can be terrific. My wife has just started. I never thought I would see it happen, but she goes with her friend Marilyn, and they go and do their circuit together, and they're both very happy. Cycling in a group is very good. The problem with disease does not just hit the person. The disease hits the family. The caregiver burden of caring for people with disease can be immense. And there's more and more work coming out that, in fact, there's a benefit to caregivers exercising. There can even be a benefit for both the caregiver and the person they're looking after to both go to a place and exercise. So dyad training is when 2 people are working together. Now, I'm involved in research where people who have home care aides, we train the home care aide to give exercise to the elderly person in their home. I mean, if you live 10 miles from the gym and you're in Iowa and it's cold and it's snowy, you've got to adapt. This is all about adaptation. So do it in the home. So, coming to the end, I hope I've persuaded you so far that I'm partly delusional. Now I'm going to show you that I'm fully delusional. Okay. So I've decided that I have a new goal in life. Okay? And this is for the people in the audience who are about 20. Okay? My new goal is to break a world record. I'm going to show you what that world record is. So for those of you in your 20s, you're going to have to hang around for another 43 years. I'm 62. Okay? And this is what I want to do at 105. So this gentleman here, okay, he did 14 miles per hour at the age of 105. So for those of you, by the way, is anybody older than 105? So anybody in the room older than 105 who wants to tell me I'm too old to exercise, my hat off to you. That's fine. But if you're under 105, okay, and look how happy he is. And you know what he said? He said, if they'd have told me that I only had another 10 minutes to go, I'd have gone even faster. So I've got to do 2 things, okay? I've got to hang around for another 43 years, and then all of you in your 20s, come back when you're in your 60s and see. By then, I think that 14 miles will be quite a bit longer. I think this is a record people will go for. Now, people in Iowa, have one huge advantage at this world record compared with anybody else. And who wants to tell me what that huge advantage is? Well, it's so flat. I heard somebody, that's a big advantage, because when you're heavy like me, you don't like hills. Did somebody else mention something else? Ragbri. So here we have it. This year it's across northern Iowa. And if you just go out and support the cyclists, that's great. If you go and ride for one day, that's great. If you go and ride for all the days, that's even better. So really, the world record at 105 should really come from Iowa. Now, there are many ways to exercise the brain. This is just a cartoon to give you a sense. For Parkinson's disease, there is rock-steady boxing. A cycle like this can easily go in your house. Put it in your front room. I mean, it's going to do you a lot of good. If you have a small place, make it pride of place. You can stretch. You can do dancing. There are lots of things you can do. Now, in summary, what I hope you walk away with, you're going to forget all the details, I know that. But remember, resistance training is good. Remember, endurance exercise may, I repeat, may grow new neurons. It's been shown in animals, clearly. Exercise can alter cortical volume and subcortical volume. There are beneficial acute effects of exercise and chronic effects. It's good for children, it's good for adults. There's no disease I'm aware of for which exercise is not beneficial. I have put in this final little check because if anybody in the audience here hasn't been exercising very much and you are a little bit wiser, then I think the best thing to do is certainly check with your physician. I would hate for one of you to kind of get motivated, go out, overdo it. So, one can't just jump into this in a very vigorous way. One has to build up gradually. To give you a sense, when I do my studies, I have people with Parkinson's disease. I get their heart rate up to 80, 85% max, and they can do it. And I've done it on 129 people. So these are people with Parkinson's disease, but we take many weeks to do that. We don't bring them in on day one and get the heart going. So, before I get to my final slide, slide but one, you probably all realize that I'm English, and told you I'm English. My final slide is a quote from the 3-time Prime Minister of England in the last century. I show it not because I'm English, I show it because I still haven't found a better final slide. And this is from Edward Stanley. Those who think they have not time for bodily exercise will sooner or later have to find time for illness. Thank you very much for your attention.
We should invite you back in 43 years.
You should invite me back in 43 years. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'll try to be here. We have time for questions. We have a mic. There's a mic right here. If you could go to the mic.
I'm always curious about the definition of intensity. Is it heart rate? Is it max heart rate? Is it a percentage of maximum heart rate? So how do you define moderate and intense exercise?
This is a very difficult question to answer. So you can look at it in several ways, okay? One, when you just at a kind of a conversational level, so moderate exercise, you can hold a conversation. And when you're working out intensely, it's really hard to hold a conversation. There is something called the Borg scale. You can look at things like perceived effort. I do it in my study. I do it by measuring maximal heart rate. So for me, when you're exercising at maximal heart rate, when you're exercising at 80 to 85% of maximal heart rate, that is high intensity, and 60 to 65% is moderate intensity. But if you read the literature, all those comments you made tend to be confounded. So what may be moderate for one person may be intense for somebody else, or high intensity for somebody else. And then that gets complicated when you find that your study, and I just found this recently, the results conflict with another study. But when you actually work out how intensely they were working, the studies are the same, but they use different words. So this is not straightforward.
So subjective criteria are as important as objective criteria in that respect? In other words, being able to hold a conversation or not?
No, that's not what I'm saying. The reason for mentioning the conversation is that not everybody goes out and gets a heart rate monitor, and not everybody goes out and does a maximal heart rate, and not everybody is interested in that degree of monitoring. And so if you're just working out and you want a kind of a simple guideline, if you have two of you on a treadmill, you have you and your friend on the treadmill, and you're going along, and you're both holding a nice conversation, that is generally moderate. And if you happen to be recording heart rate at that time, my prediction is it would be under about 70%, 65, 60. If you then turn up the treadmill in speed, or you turn up the incline, so you're now walking up a hill, as you reach the point that you're no longer able to hold an easy conversation, then you're now starting to work at a high. So I use that as a way of just easy communication to people who are not measuring heart rate. We also use it in our studies to screen people. So if we want to exclude people who've been exercising at high intensity, we ask them questions like that. And if we find out that their exercise has put them out of the conversational range, then we won't use them if that's one of our exclusion criteria.
Interesting. Thank you. Another question?
I was actually wondering how quickly the brain degenerates after exercise stops.
Now that's a very clever question, and I have absolutely no idea. Okay? I have no idea.
The reason I bring that up is because sometimes during you come into finals week, or you come to a point in your life where you can't work out, so you have to stop for a little bit, and I don't know, I feel stupider sometimes, so.
Well, so look, okay, I've been a professor a long time, and I've had kids who've gone through school, and I know the stresses of finals week, and I know all of this. But there is, evidence that I think you can look in the literature that people sometimes before doing their LSATs, they would have worked out, and I think this has actually been studied. So I think, the idea of cramming, going 2 straight nights without sleep and things like that, it's not the way to go. Now, the good news is that when one is young, the brain is remarkably resilient. And so, you can get away with a lot. But, my job here is to preach best practice. And I think best practice is to kind of regular and often.
Thank you.
So now the difficult question is going to come. So I hope you're all ready to help me answer it.
You mentioned neuroplasticity in the list of things that exercise helps. So have they looked at things like phantom limbs, or when there's amputees and the regeneration of the neurons, like when the homunculus moves with exercise?
That's a very good question. I don't know whether they've done that. Certainly the phantom limb pain is a real problem. By the way, if you ever want a great, great speaker to come here, the person behind that is B.S. Ramachandran, and he's done all the work on phantom pain, and he's a magnificent speaker. But how exercise affects that, I don't know. He has many, many tricks for dealing with phantom pain, including, for example, the use of mirrors. So you're basically tricking the phantom limb into thinking it's a real limb. But I'm not aware that they've done any exercise on that. But he's very nice. You could just email him, because he's the master.
Okay.
My small brain has a question that connects screens and music and exercise. If you watch the documentary Alive Inside, it gets familiar music gets people up and on their feet. It does something to get them moving. We have espresso bikes on campus that are screens, bicycles, 40 interactive courses. You can put music on, you can do this screen thing, like we have screens in front of us, and combining all that, getting your brain going with the music, doing the screen, sitting there, and the gears are really, I think there's some really potential for us. And it's the espresso bike is what got me moving 5 years ago in the gym here on campus.
Well, I haven't seen the espresso bike, but the espresso bike sounds great. And if you go back to my slide on the exercise where I had the tandem, you want to get as much information coming in. Now, you can reach a point of overload. So when you kind of put that all together, I wasn't sure whether there wasn't one too many stimuli coming in, but I haven't seen it. But there's no question that if you want to get a person with Parkinson's disease to walk quite well, then the Sousa marches work very, very well. I mean, these are kind of big, vibrant, musical. So music is terrific. It also has a very potent effect on one's affect. I will be spinning tomorrow morning at 6:45. I did tell Morgan that too much rap and too much techno would not work too well for me, although I'm sure it works brilliantly for many, many other people. So absolutely, because the reason a lot of people like to exercise is the music. So a lot of people like Zumba. Tango is quite a terrific medium of dance. And it seems to have done you the world of good, so I think it's terrific. I have to leave tomorrow, but I hope to be back sometime before I'm 105. And maybe you can show me. Maybe we can actually do it together, because I need to keep going at 14 miles an hour.
And I think, too, you can compete against yourself, or you can compete virtually against any of us in the room. My records are out there, so knock me out of the lead, all right?
Put competition into the mix.
Yeah, well, I'm a little bit nervous that you're going to push that 14-mile. Actually, I'm not sure which one of us is oldest, so but it's going to get up there, right?
Okay, so I know you were talking about differences between strength and endurance and what they can potentially improve in the brain. But do you think there's maybe a difference between doing strength and endurance versus a sport where it's not so measured and you're not focusing just on strength or endurance, but a combination of both?
Well, okay, so I'm going to give you two separate answers, but I'm not speaking out of both sides of my mouth, okay? So the big message I want to leave you with, is exercise is good for you, okay? So if you love a sport, do a sport. If your relatives love a sport, do a sport, whether it's table tennis, whether it's tennis, whatever it is, and it's going to be really, really good for you. Similarly with dancing, etc. And the evidence from studies of epidemiology, this is when you look at large groups of people, for example, people who've exercised all their life, they get Parkinson's disease later on average than people who didn't. So there's accumulating evidence that a lifestyle of physical activity has a good long-term effect. And that's the message I want to leave you with. So I'm now going to give you another message, okay? So when I'm not being evangelical about exercise, my job is to be a scientist. Now, to really answer important questions about neuroprotection, you really have to get very, very precise measures of dose of exercise. And so when you've got things like heart rate, you can kind of start to measure it. When you're doing weight training, you can look at the amount of weight that is being lifted. you can also convert that to metabolic equivalent units or other measures of energy expenditure. And so the big advantage of weight training and endurance exercise is it can be tightly controlled. It can be tightly controlled in animal models. And when you start looking at things like tango, which is terrific and causes changes in the brain, it's very, very difficult to quantify the dose of exercise. And what we're really after is kind of guidelines, because my long-term goal, where I really want to go with this, is to get as much help. I mean, however the medical system works out, it doesn't really matter what medical system you prefer. The important thing at some level is preventative health care. Is at some level people get some assistance with that. Okay? And so the idea being that you can then have minimum exercise doses which people can have help achieving. Because some people just find it much easier if they have exercise scientists with them, a trainer or a physical therapist. And so there are many, many ways to do exercise, and I'm a big fan of all of them. Okay? And if you look at the lady down there, I mean, that's quite impressive. Okay? And so I think one should do what one enjoys, but if you really want to take the scientific approach, and some people do, and they put on their heart rate monitors, we're getting closer and closer to being able to titrate the dosage to optimize it for one's health.
Is there one more question? While she's coming to the microphone, I'll just do a plug. My colleague and I have a dance program for people with Parkinson's here at Ames every Tuesday afternoon. So if you know someone with Parkinson's and they would like to come, it's at 4 o'clock on Tuesday afternoons, and it's at the First Baptist Church on Lynn Street.
I work at On With Life, brain injury rehab in Ankeny, and one of the things we've recently implemented in our outpatient program is called Big and Loud, which has amplified movements and vocalizations, and we have found that to be very helpful with our Parkinson's people. We also have the boxing thing that you mentioned earlier, but is there a, can you recommend some studies or papers that I can take back for our therapist that would kind of summarize your presentation?
Yes, if you email me.
All right.
Okay, so thank you for pointing that out. So I probably should have added the Big and Loud to my presentation. It is a very, very effective form of treatment. So the treatment originally started in voice. So if you have Parkinson's disease, as the disease progresses, you end up with what is called hypokinetic dysarthria. And so your speech becomes softer and it becomes harder to understand. And so there's the LSVT, which is the Lee Silverman voice therapy, which basically teaches you to talk big. And so the idea here is that the basal ganglia, which is involved in speech, is no longer working well, and you can then use the cortex to kind of drive the speech intentionally. It does wear off after a while, and so you need to go back. It's not like you can just do LSVT and stop. And then there's been a group in Arizona who've now taken it to limb movement. So the reason this is so important is the Parkinson's disease is classically defined as a hypokinetic disease. So what happens is at the end stage of the disease, the person starts, you get this kind of classic flexed posture, and you lose your arm swing. And so the idea is you get people to stand tall and make these big, wide movements. And it is very effective. There have been several articles published. I can send you those. I can certainly send you a PDF of my presentation. Be happy to do that. I would actually, to be honest, If you talk with Anne, I think I've been videotaped.
Yes, this is
Okay.
videoed. I don't know the URL, but I will have information if you go to the Department of Kinesiology, our homepage. I will have information there, or else the URL that you can click on. So this is all being videotaped.
Yes, I probably wasn't very smart to admit that I'm delusional because it's been videotaped, but I completely forgotten that when I was actually talking. So anyway, I'm sure they will get you the videotape and you can just play it, or I can send you the PDF, and I can send you the references for the movement equivalent of LSVT.
And so now everyone can moderately walk to your cars, right? Get up and do jumping jacks. Let's thank Dr. Kokras again. Thank you all for coming, and we hope we see you again in February.